Thank you all so much for joining us for Theater Thursdays. We are thrilled that you've been joining us and very excited to announce that with the month of October, we will be revisiting a spooky CBT favorite, Sweeney Todd. So make sure you mark your calendars and tune in each week as we've got some really fabulous guests lined up for you. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are speaking to you today from Knoxville, Tennessee, which are the native lands of the Yuchi and Muskogee Creek people, as well as the Cherokee nations. And I would like to acknowledge the indigenous stewards of this land, both past and present.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you are listening to this. My name is Cal MacLean. I'm the artistic director for the Clarence Brown Theatre and the director of the production of Sweeney Todd that we did several years ago. It's my pleasure to be on Theater Thursdays and talk to you a little bit about the production. Let's begin at the beginning. Shortly after I arrived in Knoxville in 2006, Tom Cervone, the managing director of the Clarence Brown, and I were summoned to the offices of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra to have a meeting with Maestro Lucas Richmond, the music director at the time, and Rachel Ford, who is still the executive director. They asked us one question. They said, "We'd like to collaborate with you. Do you have any suggestions on pieces that we could do together?" I was somewhat ready for that question and had some answers readily available and gave them 3 shows that I thought we could do together. Amadeus by Peter Schaffer, Sweeney Todd by Stephen Sondheim, and Candide by Leonard Bernstein. It was pretty straightforward that we should start with Amadeus, then do Sweeney Todd, and then finish up with Candide. And we pretty much did them in those orders. We did Amadeus in 2010, Sweeney Todd in 2012, and after a 6-year hiatus, did Candide in 2018. Amadeus was pretty easily identified as the first one we should do because the action of the play and the music of the show were fairly well differentiated. There was not a lot of blending that you had to do between the 2 presentations, the orchestras and the plays. And we learned a lot from that first presentation. We learned about the sound challenges. We learned about the staging challenges, particularly when you have a 35, 36-piece orchestra occupying the center of the stage. When we got to Sweeney Todd, the problems mounted. When I had my first meetings with the designers, I read several things from a document that I usually compose for the initial design meetings. That pretty much states my point of view about the production, my point of view about the material that we're doing, and bringing out the particular questions that we have to solve in the design process. Sondheim's Sweeney Todd is a comic melodrama that considers the consequences of obsession. Harold Prince chose to add a layer of social thought into the presentation that is touched on in Wheeler's libretto and Bond's play. Freely flows the blood of those who moralize. That's a lyric from the show. Does not encourage taking the morality tale too far, nor does the comedy. Melodrama does not shy away from excess. Melodrama loves big emotions, sweeping action, and terror. The important thing to keep in mind is that melodrama dramatizes the beating of the human heart. And in this story, the human heart beats toward blind obsession. Production I have in mind will not lose sight of the human psychology, the desperate attempts each character tries to satisfy individual obsessions. They are scared, wounded, desperate, warm-blooded, and human animals. was really important to me that the story be about human beings and not automatons or scary monsters dehumanized by a cold and unfeeling society, mechanized society. Victorian London is certainly the beginning in full force of the Industrial Revolution. And some of the play's thought is grounded in the fact that the mechanization of the time, the industrialization of the time, the soot and the grime and the dehumanization is part of the story. But still, the characters in Sweeney Todd are human beings. They're not automatons. They're not functions of social thought. They are human beings with obsessions, and those obsessions drive them to unspeakable crimes. One of the things that was so important to me was the humor in Sweeney Todd. And you might think that a barber who cuts the throats of his customers and has his landlady bake them into meat pies is not terribly funny, but the very excess of that is brought out over and over again in the story in a humorous way. And part of terror, part of horror stories is humor, because it grounds the action in things that are familiar, things that we can laugh at, things that we recognize in our everyday life, even if it is brought to an extreme, and even if it is brought to things that we hope we do not ever encounter. So it was really important to me that we consider not only the theatricality of it, but also the humor, the human humor of the story. Sweeney borrows faithfully from three theatrical sources: the melodramatic tradition, the horror theater of the French Grand Guignol, and the romantic moralists of the 19th century, such as Dickens and Victor Hugo. From melodrama, Sweeney takes heightened emotions and tensions, orchestrated plot devices, and the skillful use of comic and tragic moods. Grand Guignol contributes shocking violence and horror, thrilling theatricality, and indulges in the prurient while propping up conventional morality. To the Romantics, social injustice was the product of individual corruption because someone does something unjust. Dickens' social fabric was woven by individual decisions. Hugo traces large-scale social chaos back to the actions of individuals. The great Romantic writers led logically to the psychological realists. Both were fascinated by how people ticked and how individuals bear responsibility for the conditions of the society they inhabit. It was a terrific production to work on. It's one of the few shows that I've ever directed twice. I directed it once before in the 90s in a very different production, and got another crack at it in 2010 with some wonderful people. And for those of you who happened to see it, I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly had a wonderful time doing it.